So I can use this one. This one is on.
Is it?
Can you put? Yeah. So good morning, everyone, and I would like to welcome you to this session on peatland and climate change. So let me introduce myself first. My name is Christelle Ergualge. I've been working as a scientist for CIFOR over the past 10 years on the research related to land use and land use change and emissions of greenhouse gases. I'm also an author of the IPCC guidelines in the wetland supplement that was published in 2014 and for the current refinement of the 2006 IPCC guidelines. I would like to thank the organizers for the hard work over the past months to make this event possible, and to the 5 speakers who are going to contribute to this very important session. Next, please. So in this session, we want to learn more about greenhouse gases emissions, and in particular, how to evaluate the impact of peatlands on climate change. If we talk about how, we're going to talk, of course, about methods, and we're going also to talk about capacity, either technical or financial. And we need to make sure that we have the methods, the appropriate methods, and the capacity to gather data of sufficient quality and sufficient data to reach have maps on the land uses on peat. And we also, of course, need greenhouse gas emission factors for each impact type. In this session, most of our speakers are going to talk about greenhouse gas emission factors. So I'm going to provide some background information, especially for people in the audience who are not specialists in this area. So we scientists usually use what we call a space for time substitution approach, which means that, next please, we have a reference site and we have an impact site where we have an activity taking place. And we assume that the original condition at the impact sites are the same as at the reference site. I put a plural because we want also to have replicate sites. When we measure the emissions of greenhouse gases at a site where we have an activity implemented, and where we know greenhouse gases emissions are not constant over time, we also aim to have a chronosequence approach, which means that in the case of oil palm plantation, we are going to study plots with different ages of palm. Yeah, thank you. So, sorry. Well, the red light doesn't work. This stands also for restoration activities. If we start implementing a restoration activity, we need to measure the emissions of greenhouse gases in plots where the activity was implemented since different years. We have two generic methods that we use to measure CO2 emissions from an activity, and these are called the stock difference and the flux gain loss change. So the stock change approach is quite common. We measure the carbon stocks at time 1 or in a reference site, and we measure the stocks of carbon at time 2 or in a site where we have an activity taking place. And by calculating the difference between the two of them, we know how much carbon is gained or lost. The flux change approach is more complex. At time 1, we are going to measure all the fluxes of carbon getting into the system and all the fluxes going out of the system, and we calculate a balance. We do that at time 2 or in the site where we have an activity taking place, and we calculate the difference of the two balances to know how much carbon is being gained or lost. The case of peatlands is a bit specific because we need to use different methods for different carbon pools. In general, we use the stock difference method for quantifying the losses from the biomass because it's the most cost-effective method. For the soil, the stock difference method is not recommended by bodies such as the IPCC when it's used in space for time substitution design. And the reason is the extreme and natural spatial variability of peat depth. So we cannot make the assumption that the reference site is representative of the site where we have the activity taking place. This is why the flux method is much more commonly applied for peat soils. It's complex. We need to measure all the carbon that gets into the soil through litter fall and root mortality, all the carbon that goes out of the soil through heterotrophic soil respiration, that is the decomposition by the microbes, and all the carbon that is lost in a soluble form. We also need to measure emissions of methane and of nitrous oxide. And the net peat CO2 emission is what is in the green box. At ecosystem level, we can use either a combination of the above methods, so the flux method for the soil and the stock difference method for the biomass, or we can focus exclusively on the fluxes, but for this we need towers that are installed in the sites, and where we measure, we have sensors, where we measure the emissions or the uptakes of greenhouse gases emissions above the canopy. So I'm not going to go further into these technical details. This is background information that we can use after for discussion. And so we have today 5 speakers. And I'm going to invite the first speaker, Dr. Famudi Nagus, who is a research scientist at the Indonesian Soil Research Institute under the Ministry of Agriculture. His research mainly focuses on sustainable tropical peatland management and CO2 emissions from peat. He's a member of the IPCC Task Force Bureau for Greenhouse Gas Inventories for the 6th assessment report. And Famudi is going to make us a presentation on peat water table dynamics, subsidence, and CO2 emissions. So, welcome, Famudi.
Thank you, Crystal, for the introduction. Yeah, so this is a broad presentation on subsidence and water relationship and also emission. The 2011 map of the Indonesian Center for Land Resources Research and Development came up with the estimate of about 15 million hectares of peatland. So this is a correction of the previous Wetland International, which has the same author as Eritung and so on. This is because in the previous version we relied so much on the remote sensing technique, but now we have more and more ground-based data. We also present in that map the distribution of the depths, but bear in mind that the depth distribution is also very rough because the frequency, the intensity of the augering is not that high. So it will require, if there is a kind of remote sensing technique to determine the depth of the pit, but it's not available yet. So for the national level, we have, if we have a weighted average, we have about the average depth of our pit is about 2.5 meters. And every meter, every hectare has about 500 tons of carbon. So you can have an estimate of the national carbon stock. Here, this is a much lower estimate compared to Susan Page's estimation because she used the previous map and also the deeper estimate of the peatland. So the land cover, so we have forest land, but lots of area has been used for intensive agriculture, as well as traditional low-input agriculture. And not always that the traditional agriculture system have a higher water table. The example of high water table is for sago plantation, but for maize, for annual grain crop, it's also deep water table. Large area is under peat shrub. So the estimate of 2015, about 3.9 million hectares is under shrub. And perhaps this is a good area for the first object of the peatland restoration. Around 2.25 million hectares under plantation, and including 2 million hectares for oil palm plantation. And there are various uses of peatland. And this shrub area is, has high emission because they are affected by the drainage and also have a high fire risk, and it has no economic benefit. So this is our ongoing research in Jambi. This is just the rainfall distribution. So we have January and February, which is a little bit dry, but March till June, it's very wet, and in July, it's relatively dry again. And we monitor the water table for oil palm plantation. This on the left, the upper left, has about 50 to 70 centimeter of drainage level. And this one on the bottom left, the canal was not functioning, so it has a higher water table. So in many months it was flooded, but interestingly enough that the farmers claim that it didn't affect the bunch yield. And as a comparison, we have forests, which was really flooded in many months. However, in July, our observation is that the water table in the forest start to reach below 40 centimeter. And this is the 6 months estimate of the emission, where we have relatively low emission for the forest compared to the oil palm plantation. And we expect that from July till December, especially July till September, the figure will be increasing and will be decreased again in October because of the onset of the rainy season. This is another experiment in Central Kalimantan under rubber plantation and shrub. So what we see here is that this is under the control of 2.5 meter drainage. So what we see that the water table easily exceed 100 centimeter below the surface. And for the canal, for the ditch, it goes to 2 meters during the dry season. So this is an example. If you have the drainage too deep, it's very difficult to maintain the water table even during the rainy season. At the same site, our colleague conducted an experiment looking at the relationship of water table and CO2 emission. And she found out that for every additional 1 centimeter depth of the water table, there is an increase of about 0.37 tons of CO2 per hectare per year. This is much lower estimate compared to the previous Hoyer. Also low. So this means that if we have the deep profile under undrained condition, which translate to deep drainage, and during the dry season, this unsaturated drainage tend to be moist, so it has a high capacity of emission. This research has studied about the influence of root respiration. Crystal introduced a little bit about the soil respiration, but the soil respiration composed of the root respiration and the microbial decomposition. And while the root respiration has been accounted for by the addition of the biomass, because the CO2 that is absorbed from the atmosphere is stored in the biomass, and some of it comes out of the root, and this portion of the CO2 that comes from the root has to be taken into account. What we see here is that closer to the palm, this is going there is the distance from the oil palm. Closer to the palm, there is a higher contribution of the root respiration. And from this graph, if you are taking the measurement about 3 meters from the palm or further, you tend to minimize the influence of the root respiration. However, here the new research from Siti Fatimah Batubara in North Sumatra under the 25-year-old oil palm plantation, she found out that if you have the root exclusion of 20 centimeter, it means that your chamber goes into the soil as deep as 20 centimeter. So it cut at least 20 centimeter of the root. Then the estimate of the emission is about 56 tons per hectare per year. And if you cut it deeper, if you have your chamber 60 centimeter, it's around 40 tons per hectare per year. So this means that, well, the point of the measurement is at 4.5 meters. It means that for this oil palm plantation, the influence of the root is still significant up until the furthest point from palm. So the root respiration is dependent on the plant age, the measurement position, and the measurement method, whether they have the deep cutting of the root or not. And this one is the peat subsidence measurement. Dr. Maswar has installed about 40 subsidence poles. It's from at different location and different land uses. And the first 4 or 5 years measurement come up with this result, that the range of the subsidence is about 2.8 to 5.5 centimeter annually, and that the subsidence under oil palm plantation is much lower compared to the annual crop rotation, shrub and rubber plantation. And this may be because for the oil palm plantation, they use machinery in the land preparation so that the soil is more compacted. And we had also the measurement in Papua, and we don't go there very often because of the costs and also some other reason. But the subsidence is almost zero because they don't have the drainage. So if we go back, we have the rate of subsidence, and with time, we will be reaching what we call the undrainable level. So say if we have about 2.5 centimeter, in about one cycle of oil palm plantation, the surface of the peat will go down about 75 centimeter. And here, at the undrainable level, maybe the paludiculture or whatsoever must be implemented. Now there are reservations to implement this paludiculture and so forth. Although the rate of subsidence decreased with time since the time of the drainage installed. So this is just a summary of what we have now for the national level, the Tier 1, or you can say Tier 2 because it's mostly in Sumatra, in Indonesia and Malaysia, emission factor for peat, despite the variation. So we are encouraged, of course, to have the subnational level emission factor. So in conclusion, I would like to say that the high water table is associated with a low emission rate and also low subsidence rate. Although it's not necessarily keep the water above a threshold level, such as one which is recommended by BRG of 0.4 meter above surface. There is an ideal moisture content for microbial decomposition. So it means that if you have a deeper drainage, your soil is moist during the rainy season, and it's easily decomposed. And research in the future is challenged by the sources of uncertainty because of the methods. There are methods of using gas chromatography which tend to give you lower estimate of greenhouse gas emission. IRGA has a higher estimate, and the subsidence all have pros and cons. Separation between autotrophic and heterotrophic respiration in closed chamber technique is a challenge, as well as separation between heterotrophic respiration and consolidation in subsidence technique. So that's what I have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Famuddin, for providing this overview of your research and the research by the IPCC and mentioning the challenges. We are a bit delayed, so maybe we have time for one question and then we will move to the next speaker.
Thank you, Pak Agus, for your presentation. I have just short question related that canal blocking with peat decomposition. Maybe we know many activity in PHC to reduce emission doing canal blocking in the drainage area. But my question, after we do canal blocking, is the emission from peat decomposition will be stopped or reduce or something? I think Indonesian information is important because too many activity doing canal blocking and not yet calculate in the carbon accounting in Indonesia. Thank you.
Yeah. So for the one of the relationship, and there are many other research paper which shows the relationship of water table and the emission. So if you increase the water table, it means the drainage is shallower, you decrease the emission. It doesn't stop it because the current theory, if you really flooded it, if you in chapter, I guess chapter 1 of the IPCC 2014, if you re-wet the peatland, you tend to bring again the emission to zero. But re-wetting is total re-wetting, which is probably impossible. But if you increase it, you reduce emission. And of course, you also reduce the risk of fire.
Thank you. So we're going to move to the next speaker. Dr. Imam Basuki is a researcher studying carbon dynamics from land use change in tropical peatland. He's a PhD graduated from Oregon State University in the US, and he's working with Windrock International as a peatland scientist on reducing greenhouse gas emissions from peatlands with a jurisdictional framework.
Thank you, Crystal, for the introduction. Good morning, everyone. My talk will be about sharing experience from West Kalimantan and Riau. I did two main activities. First is about assessing emission factors using what had been described by Dr. Crystal previously, using the carbon stock change, and then also assessing emission factor using carbon flux change approach. And then the third one from Riau, the experience from Riau is about estimating greenhouse gas emission or emission factor using indicator such as water table groundwater table, just had been described by Dr. Agus Fahmudin. Next slide. Okay. So for first activity I did in West Kalimantan, I used 19 sampling plots, 19 transects covering different land use types in Pematang Gadung Pit Dome. On the right-hand side, you can see the map of Pematang Gadung Pit Dome in dark green, and then the different land use type covering intact pit swamp forest, log pit swamp forest, early seral, and then also oil palm plantation, young oil palm plantation, up to 5 years old only. And then in this 19 transects or sampling plot that I use protocol, standard protocol from CIFOR, created by Professor Daniel Mudiarso et al. And also Boone Kaufman et al. I did ecosystem carbon stock measurement. So I took samples and also measurement from different carbon pools in each ecosystem, in each land use type. And then using the carbon stock change approach, comparing the ecosystem carbon stock to see what have been emitted from the land use change process. Sorry for the crowded figure, but I will talk a bit slower in here. You can see on the left-hand side the figure of transition, land use change from intact forest into log over pit swamp forest, and then cleared by the people for agriculture activities as early seral that will be regenerated to be forest if it is an intact or left over. And then also on the other side of the figure is the oil palm plantation, young oil palm plantation, smallholder oil palm plantation. And from the comparison between ecosystem, we can see that there is a significant difference of carbon stock from this ecosystem. We can see on the right-hand side, on that corner, the different carbon stock from average carbon stock, ecosystem carbon stock from intact forest, which is up to 5,000 ton per hectare of carbon. And then next, lower on the log over forest carbon stock, which is about 4,000 only. And then much lower on the early seral ecosystem. On the lower hand side, you can see the transect that I made. I described previously about taking all the samples from different carbon pools, above ground carbon pools, below ground carbon pools, as previously also described by Dr. Crystal. And then the last figure here, showing you the comparison between different ecosystem in the world, comparing the carbon stock from this ecosystem. And pit swamp forest in Indonesia is the top or the richest ecosystem for carbon stock, reaching almost about more than 4,000 ton carbon per hectare, compared to the other lowland forest in Brazil, for example, or conifer forest in United States, which has very big trees, very dense above ground carbon stock, but very low below ground carbon stock. That's my first assessment on emission factor. And then here is what I can compare between the ecosystem. For example, on the right-hand side over there, from intact pit swamp forest to log pit swamp forest, there is a potential emission, the loss of carbon from the change because of the disturbance almost 2,000 ton per hectare. And then if we consider the time average or the activity that have been done in this ecosystem, for example, I knew that it has been converted for 25 years. Then we just averaging by the year. So 2,000 ton per hectare divided by 25 years. Then you can come up with estimated emission factor annually. And also for the next bar, you can see if you change the intact forest into early seral ecosystem, then you may emit much more carbon to the atmosphere, more than 4,000 ton CO2 equivalent per hectare. Then you have to do a time average process again. This is what I did using carbon stock change approach. Even though that it is not recommended because of the variation in peat depth, as we know in tropical peat ecosystem, but because this is cost-efficient approach, then probably there is an opportunity to do a better work for this approach, like we do the second measurement for carbon stock. So we don't do a chronosequence, but we compare time 2 to time 1 measurement. So we will have more accurate result. Then the second approach that I did is using the carbon flux approach. That is by comparing the gain and loss of carbon from atmosphere, again into the ecosystem by photosynthesis process, and then release again through the respiration process or heterotrophic respiration process. In this approach, I did in 12 plots in West Kalimantan, the same area, but with limited number of plots compared to the carbon stock approach, because we don't have enough resource for to have more plots. But at least for each land use type, I can have 3 replication. And in each plot, I did a measurement on diameter for 3 diameter to measure it for a year time period, and also collecting liter fall to see the production of tree, measuring the respiration, heterotrophic and total respiration from the soil, and then come up with the comparison between the net primary production as a gain component of this flux change approach, and then also come up with heterotrophic respiration. And the difference between these two, we can use to estimate the net ecosystem production of each ecosystem. And comparing between these two, we can estimate the emission factor by adding the factor of above ground carbon loss, as previously described by Dr. Crystal, and also adding the factor of fire, emission from fire, etc., or N2O emission. And then we can come up with the emission factor using this approach. And the other figure here showing you the comparison between net ecosystem production among different ecosystem. Mangrove in Indonesia, peat swamp forest in Indonesia, and other ecosystem in other area. So it is clear that peat swamp forest is among the most productive ecosystem in terms of net ecosystem production. And then this table showing you if we want to use this approach to come up with estimation of annual emission from each ecosystem by adding the factor of fire, above ground carbon loss, dissolved organic carbon loss, methane loss, etc. We can discuss it later in detail. And then the third approach I did is estimating greenhouse gas emission using groundwater table measurement. This work I did in Riau with Windrock international team working together with the local government of SIAC and BRG to work together in the framework of jurisdictional kind of landscape management approach to have a balance, a kind of balance management of landscape between development and also conservation side. So we try to have this work together, and then we help the local government working together with them to see if we can come up with quite applicable method to measure or estimating greenhouse gas emission in their areas. So the map showing the different sample site we did in the area, and then also the groundwater table pipe that we use. And this is the LoRaWAN long-range wide area network that we used in the area. We try to apply quite cheap or cost-effective method using the laser method, and then also utilizing wireless area network to come up with this kind of application in our cell phone to see the average water table level at near real time. And then we will check every single day, hourly even. We tried it for 2 months, and then we learn from it. And from it, we try to come up with the estimation of CO2 emission from peat decomposition. And later on, we can also use it to assess the potential greenhouse gas emission. So that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Imam. So we're going to limit again to one question because we're still late. Is there any question from the audience? No?
Thank you. I just need a bit explanation or elaboration from Pak Agus, Pak Pamudin Agus, and Pak Imam Basuki, because they come up with a bit discrepancies of CO2 emission on palm oil. I mean, it's quite huge differences. So what kind of explanation behind this elaboration about apart from method use or whatever? Thank you.
Yeah, so for instance, we have this exact same method in Jambi and in Riau. In Riau, we had about 60 tons of CO2 emission per hectare per year in very in close sites between shrub, oil palm, rubber, and so forth. So the land cover doesn't determine that much, but the area of Riau
As an addition, also what I found in West Kalimantan, the heterotrophic respiration was not different between the forest and oil palm plantation. To remember that my oil palm plantation is a very young one, but the differences is in the production, net primary production. In the forest, of course, we have a lot more production than in the young oil palm plantation. Probably there will be a different case if it is old oil palm plantation, as we know from different research, 20 years old oil palm plantation can compete the production of primary forest. So that's, I think, also contribute to the difference.
Thank you. So I'm going to call the next speaker. Daryono Darusman is the head of research and development in the Katingan Mentaya Pit Restoration Project, which is managed by Pitirimba Makmur Utama. And Daryono has a background in physical chemistry, and he's now pursuing a doctoral degree in applied climatology at IPB.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you, Crystal, for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. In this opportunity, I would like to present our collaboration, ongoing research between the Katingan Mentaya project and CIFOR. So, as still ongoing, you will not see a lot of data like the previous presenters. So, this picture is represented maybe 0 point something our area in Katingan Mentaya projects. This is we can call degraded or drained peatlands. And from our discussion this morning, and we heard that this is subject to restore in order to reduce the emission from this degraded or drained peatlands. So if we can calculate the emission from this particular area with the numbers already provided by the IPCC, maybe Crystal, one of the author in the chapter 2. So this is a drain, I assume, for example, this is a drain, and then we can use the emission factor like 5.3 to 9.6 tons CO2 carbon per hectare per year, if this classified as a shrubland or the grasslands. In terms of methane, maybe 4.9 until 7 kilograms. So methane carbon per hectare per year. This is a scenario without rewetting, I guess. As we already accept that the rewetting will raise the water table and may reduce the emission from the pit or from the soil respirations. And so we will rewet this area, and then we rewetting this area by blocking some, it's not this big canal, not yet, but we already blocked several smaller ditches along this area. And in addition to that, so I also play with the data from literature using the meta-analysis. I compare the rewetted and drained peatlands. Most of this study measure soil total respiration. It means there is no segregations between the root respiration or autotrophic respiration and heterotrophic respirations. And you see from this forest plot analysis that rewettings will reduce the emissions from the pit repetitions with the number lang ya. So and then I play with this 22 case study, and then the overall random effect size is rewettings proof can reduce the pit respiration or pit emissions. And then in terms of methane, as you would expect, that the rewetting will increase at some point for the emission from methanes after we following the rewetting or restorations. But when we add these two components of greenhouse gas, CO2 and methane, still that the rewetting will had based on our my playing with this forest plot analysis and meta-analysis, had a net cooling effects around 3.6 ton CO2 equivalent per hectare per year. So I was convinced by this study that rewetting will reduce, so not from the experience. But when we get back to this picture, so now if this scenario, if this area is already rewetted, but then the land cover is not changed, still like this, but the water table is raised because of the canal blockings or because of the canal blockings and dams, and then we still can we just put the zero based on the IPCC? Because in the IPCC the rewetted emission factor for the rewetted is tropical peatland is 0. It's like Pak Agus mentioned later. But for I don't know if because I don't have the number, not yet happened yet for this area, but it seems just simply put the 0 here is still I mean it's uncertain. It's a big question, and we also heard from Ibu from KLHK this morning that my understanding they still account the reduction. I mean the contribution from the peatland restoration is only from the reduction of peat fires. It's not from the peat decompositions. And then if I'm not mistaken again, Ibu Emma or Ibu Ati said that because the number is still uncertain for the peat decomposition, mostly in the rewetted peatland. So it's like if the Pak Ludohong or Ibu from the KLHK can restore and put all the water, establish the canal blocking and then monitor the water table, but never come up with one number for the emission from the rewetted, and then it's only that the success story is only we can put the 100 canal blocking, but how much emission can be reduced from the rewetted area? That's the big questions. So in order to answer that, Katingan Mentaya project and here our colleague here in CIFOR try to collect some data from the field, how if what is the number of the greenhouse gas emission from the rewetted area. So this is our area designs. So we will compare to area. Once is undrained as we design as a control, and then the rewetted area as a treatment. As you see here in the dot in the middle pictures, the shortened or the lower dot is a rewetted area, the rewetted sites, and then the upper dot, the red dot, is a undrained area. And so this is only like a small part of our area. And we have measure or estimate the carbon stocks, both of the sites. It's like the carbon stock above ground. Carbon stock is not significant difference. It's almost the same. It stops in 2010s, so it could be like the vegetation is already restored. And then for the pit depth, it's also it's not so much difference between rewetted and undrained. And then bulk density, you can see 0.09 and 0.1 in the undrained and rewetted. So in the, I hope it's like next couple of months, we will gonna measure greenhouse emission in this area. So this is also our water table monitoring. You see from the upper pictures. So in 2015, as you know, the water table is very low because of the long dry seasons. And then after that, we start to block the ditches. And in the picture, in these figures show that the water table is rise. But I think it's not because also, it's not solely because of the canal blocking, but also maybe because of the wet dry seasons following the El Nino in 2016 and 2017. So we continue monitoring in 2018 and 2019. We will see if our effort in the rewetting this area will still can keep the water tables close to the surface. So that's the number in the table, 2015, 2016, and 2017. The D1 is represent the rewetted area, and then the D2 represent the undrained area, both in forested area. So this is our design for the gas measurements. This is the chamber-based methods in the field. Yeah, it's almost like even for build this broad walk, we need like more than 2 months, and the long is like the length is almost 4 kilometers from south to the north, and then we also built a circular broad walk to measure the greenhouse gas from the pit, because we don't want to disturb the pit surface when we measuring the gas. And also we put a water logger monitoring as well. So apparently it's not only us who need the broad walk when we walking in the peatlands, but also the owner of the peatland also needs, after maybe years walking in the pit or in the tree, they need some time walking in the broad walk. Thank you. This is my presentation.
Thank you. I think we are going to let the questions for the end of the session because we are running out of time. So I'm going to call now our next speaker, Meli. Meli Saragi Sasmito is currently a research consultant at CIFOR, and she holds a Master of Science from Bogor Agricultural University. She conducts research measuring the effectiveness of degraded peatlands restoration with an ecosystem function perspective, including forest structure and carbon balance dynamics. Her research interests are environmental science, carbon dynamics, tropical peatlands, and climate change.
Thank you, Crystal. My name is Meli. Today I will present about carbon dynamic of restored tropical secondary peat swamp forest. Actually, at the same site where Pak Taryono do research. In this presentation, I will show you how we quantify the carbon dynamic in restored tropical peat swamp forest, because we want to know how the carbon in and out from the ecosystem, especially in restored tropical peat swamp forest. We know that restoration is one of national priority in Indonesia since 2016, and we know that right now we still have limited numbers of the data, the comprehensive data, scientific-based data about the carbon dynamic in that ecosystem. We want to identify how effective the restoration in peat swamp forest can make it the ecosystem function of peat swamp itself in better way. We also want to provide scientific information about the potential emission reduction from the peat swamp, and we want to give the contribution to the emission level for the carbon reduction from the peat itself. Our study in Katingan started in 2015, and we try to quantify the complete carbon dynamic, which is stock and the input, the accumulation, and also the emission from this wetland ecosystem. We also try to assess the carbon emission or carbon removal, which is how much the carbon that take from the atmosphere into the living biomass in living biomass in ecosystem itself. We also try to calculate how much the carbon that emitted from the soil floor in this ecosystem, and see the relationship between the climatic condition in this area to the ecosystem. And the last, we want to evaluate the relationship between the climatic factors and see which factors that significantly impact to the carbon dynamic in this ecosystem. This study framework is bottom-up approach. We don't have any eddy covariance methods in this area because it's really costly. And we try to make a simple method. We calculate the carbon stock by field assessment, by taking samples from soil, living biomass, woody debris, and try to take the try to using allometric equation for assess the carbon stock, and we also see the accumulation into the ecosystem by stem and litter productivity from for 1.5 years, and the last we see the autotrophic respiration from the living root. And then heterotrophic respiration from the microbial biomass activity. Next. Our study conducted in Katingan Peat Swamp Forest, which is under concession of PT Rimba Makmur Utama. It ran, this company runs since 2010, I guess, and then start the each 1 hectare in north and south canal between our site, and we know that this location is a logging area in 1990, which is Ramin. And these these plots, please note that this research start when the restoration running in 3 years after, just 3 years after the restoration started. This is our experimental plot design. Actually, in the forest, 2 to 5 kilometers from the canal, we do many monitoring in this area. You can see in the slide. I know Crystal already explained about how to calculate and assess the carbon and flux before, so I don't want to continue more. And next, yeah. What about the result? This area has a lot of carbon stock, which is around 1,700 ton carbon per hectare per year in 3 and 4 meters. We know that the deeper pit, the high carbon stock in this in that soil. 90% of the carbon stock is in soil. So we can see there is no significant difference about the above and below ground living biomass for the carbon stock. After 1.5 years monitoring, we get the data about mean productivity, annual mean productivity, how much carbon removed from the living biomass by photosynthetic mechanism, and around 7 ton carbon per hectare per year is our input into the ecosystem. But we see still weak relationship between the productivity to the climatic condition. We think that the climatic don't impact the pattern of productivity because of the condition of our location is quite similar, and we can see the lowest productivity is in wet season. It's around October, and the highest productivity is in dry season. Next. And we try to calculate and monitor respiration and calculate them. And we get around 14 ton carbon per hectare per year for total annual respiration from forest floor. And then we can see a significant relationship between the groundwater level and emissions. Really strong relationship, and the total is and the microbial respiration contribute higher respiration, which is 60 to 70% of the total annual respiration from this ecosystem. And we try to make it simple for calculating the gross primary productivity, which is how much the carbon that assimilated from the atmosphere into the ecosystem. And we can, this black one is our data, and we compile with the some studies from the other studies and completed the carbon dynamic, and we can see the gross primary productivity is around 30 ton carbon per hectare per year. This number is quite similar with the AD covariance methods that have done by Hirano et al. Is around 30 also. So the bottom up and top down method is it's not really difference. And the last slide, we try to calculate the difference between in and out carbon from the ecosystem, and we can see from the gross primary we get 30.3 ton carbon, and we get the living biomass from the photosynthetic is about 10, and we get the number after that from carbon that emitted from respiration and POC, particulate organic carbon, and DOC is around 0.6. So the input and the output is can be we get the balance from the input and the output. We still emitted emitted 1.5 ton carbon per hectare per year, which is still emitted. Our paper, and here the conclusion that this data may be may contribute to the climate mitigation strategy in emission reduction. Thank you.
Thank you, Meli. Again, I think we're going to let the questions for the end, to let space for our last speaker, Solihin. Solihin is a senior advisor at Demeter. He's responsible for tasks related to GIS and remote sensing. He manages UK-funded projects on the improvement of national forest monitoring system and evaluation of projects related to deforestation and greenhouse gas emissions. He has a forestry background, graduated from the Faculty of Forestry, IPB, and Albert Ludwig Freiburg University in Germany, and he holds a PhD degree from the Australian National University.
Thank you, Crystal, for the introductions. Hello, everyone. My name is Solihin. I'm from Demeter. Today, I'm going to talk about the setting reference level for emissions and removal for peatlands in Indonesia. So actually, this has been mentioned by Pak Alu this morning. So actually, I need to acknowledge my colleagues here. So we are a team, so including Pak Daniel Murdiarso, Pak Gustian Sari, Pak Arif Wijaya, Pak Arif Darmawan, Pak Arif Budiman, Pak Judin Purwanto. You can read it. So I think most of them are here. Some, yeah. I think this could be interesting session to discuss about this exercise. Okay. So in the Ministry of Forestry, Ministry of Environment and Forestry already developed a forest reference emission level, which is designed or developed specifically for REDD+ activities. So in these documents, they include the activities including deforestation, forest degradations, and also peatlands. So almost 40% of total emissions calculated from the FRL is coming from degraded peatlands. So this is something that peatland is really important. And this estimation is exclude the peat fire. So you can imagine that peatlands become even more significant source of emissions. And after big fire in 2015, Indonesia has a strong commitment to reduce the further impact of peat fires. And as we can see in this morning, our president is making a strong statements. And in 2016, new regulations has been coming out to stop these fires and to restore the degraded peatlands. And yeah, it is important when when you do the something or to perform something. It is important to assess the performance, and a reference level is required to define the projections emission based on the historical data, including land cover change, peatland degradations, and also peat fires. And the scope of this analysis is in the degraded peatlands in 7 priority provinces. Yeah, that's where BRG are working. And we include 4 activities, including net emission from land cover change, and then emission from peat decompositions, and from canals, and also peat fires. So you can see sorry. Oh, we cannot go back, sorry. Yeah, so we can see that these 7 provinces in the chart, mostly 30% in Riau, 23% in Central Kalimantan, and yeah, in Kalimantan Barat 19%, and yeah, the rest is in South Sumatra and Jambi, and Papua is 19%. It's quite huge also there are. So this is the comparison between the methodology used in the forest reference emission level, which is submitted to UNFCCC in 2015 and approved in 2016, and this analysis in the right columns. So for area of interest, for FRL, we use all areas in Indonesia that is still forested in 1990. So it totaling for peatlands area, including it's 11.1 million hectares of peatlands. While this area is focusing on the peatlands in 14 priority KHG is what is KHG? Peat hydrological unit, sorry, in 7 priority provinces. So totaling about 11.2, actually it's 12.9. But we exclude the area that is potentially still in mineral soil. So we exclude the area based on the land cover maps. So where we found the mineral land cover from mineral soil, we exclude this area. So that's why we came up with 11.2 million hectares. So that's the difference. So this number is actually quite different. So in terms of distributions. And the activities, yeah, the red plus is focusing on deforestation and forest degradations, but also they include the peat decomposition as well. But in our analysis, we use land cover change. It means we include the deforestation, forest degradations, but not only that, but we also include the regrowth of the forest or carbon stock enhancement. And we also include the peat decomposition, same as in FRL, but we include peat fires and canal emissions. And for activity data, we mostly use the best available data, which is also official data, like from the Ministry of Forestry for land cover change and peatland distribution from Ritung et al. And additional data we use is for burn scar mapping. We also get this data from the Ministry of Forestry. And the emission factors, we mostly use the IPCC. You know that a lot of studies has been done in Indonesia, including from And we use the common methods, activity data times multiplied by emission factors. And yeah, I think everyone knows this. And this is the results of the emissions, net emission from land cover change from 2006 until 2015. Oh, sorry, there is also difference in historical periods between FREL and this analysis. FREL is using data from 1990 until 2012, but this analysis only focusing from 10 years back, so from 2006 until 2015. So we can see a lot of emissions from land cover change, which is above ground carbon stock, occurred in 2015 because of fires. So this is the emissions from peatlands. We include the peat decomposition, peat fires, and also emission from canals, which is methane and DOC losses. Yeah, the same emission factor multiplied by activity data, but for peat decomposition, yeah, again we use the IPCC wetland supplementary for the emission factors. And this is the results of the annual emissions from peat decompositions in 7 priority provinces. So we can see in 2006, it was 228 million ton CO2 and rise to 271 in 2015. And we use the nonlinear regressions, and luckily this data is quite strong, has strong correlation. So we estimate until 2030 to, this is the baseline. If we don't do or using the business as usual baseline. And from canals, we only estimate emission from the DOC loss and methane. And we use the value from IPCC 2014. And for peat fires, we use this. This is also from IPCC, the equations. And the most important thing is the value that for emission factor, we use Huijnen et al., which is published in 2017 after the fires using the data from 2015 fires. And then for peat depth burning, burn peat depth, we use these two literatures, one from Konechny, which is, we assume it is or categorized into non-El Nino years, and then Balhorn is for El Nino years. And for bulk density, we use Page et al. So this is the burn scar area. You can see in 2006, 2009, 2014, and 2015 is the highest burn scar area in these 7 priority provinces. And when we compare with the overlay with the El Nino index, you can see it's coincide with the level of El Nino index. You can see in 2006, 2009, 2014, and 2015 are El Nino. So from weak until strong, very strong El Nino, while the rest is either neutral or La Nina level. So based on this, we estimate the emission from peat fires, the depth of area that are burned, and we calculate the emission based on these calculations. Yeah, so Balhorn et al. Published in 2009, but they used the data from 2006, and Konechny published in 2016, but they used data from 2012, which is non-El Nino years. So, and this is the annual years. So you can see the difference between El Nino and non-El Nino years. So this is the aggregate emissions annually, and you can see peat fires is the variability is really high. It really depends on the climatic situations, and for the peat decompositions also quite stable, but it's really large. And yeah, from here you can see the emission projection until 2030. Yeah, and you can use the difference baseline, whether you want to use the total average or only average from El Nino and non-El Nino years. And this is the emission for our activity, and most of the emissions coming from peat decomposition, so almost more than 50%. And for peat fires is an average about 24%. So yeah, in canal it's only 6%, but land cover change is only 16%. So this number is related with land cover change. Certainly will be different with the forest reference emission level, because they only estimate or calculate based on the deforestation and forest degradation. That's why they are really high. But in this case, we include already the carbon. But during strong El Nino, peat fires contribute more emission than peat fires, than peat decomposition. And yeah, I think the most important that yeah, some areas of improvement is we can identify it, especially to use the more accurate data, which is, we have a lot of research, as our previous presenters already some are already published. So I think it's a good idea to combine or to compile this data set and become one national emission factors for Indonesia. So also for the activity data, so we have now better technology, which is can either higher accuracy or with better sensor, which can improve the accuracy of the activity data. And also important to quantify the impact of peatland. So most of the activities in the field, they did like project level or field level activities, which is normally not easy to monitor using satellite remote sensing. So ground measurement is still required for this improvement. I think that's all. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Solehin. Do we have any questions from the audience?
Thank you. I'm Susilo. I'm from Norwegian Embassy. I have a question to Pak Solehin. It would be interesting to see the dynamics between land use or use of peats in these different provinces. And from that, whether or not you could infer a conclusion whether fire is anthropogenic or a natural disaster. Your take, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Pak Ilo. From our analysis, we just have the burn scar area digitized from satellite data, and unfortunately, we don't have good data for historical data sets. But since 2000, maybe 2000, we have better data because Landsat is already freely available and can be accessed. And from there, we digitize the burn scar manually. There is, you know, to understand whether it is anthropogenic or not, we need to have further data, or we need to interpret and then can spread into the peatlands. And sometimes it's even go further where not people's there, and people think this is not anthropogenic. But you have to go back from where the fires begin. Mostly close to the road, close to the settlements, or close to the what you call agricultural area. So yeah, I think that's my question.
Do we have another question? Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much to all the presenters for these very informative presentations. My question in first hand goes also to Pa Solihin, but also to the others, if they can contribute. The question is about the emissions, you named it emissions from the channels. It's about the DOC. So I'm always wondering if we really, from a scientific point of view, capture this part which leaves the peatland and contributes to climate change, or being an emission or having an exchange with the atmosphere somewhere else. It can be in the channel, it can be in the river, it can be in the sea. And from very recent studies in temperate regions, in Europe, for example, we know that these emissions can be much higher than the direct exchange with the atmosphere. So my question would be, how do you scientifically capture this, or do you have this in your calculation, this DOC, which is a product of the peat decomposition?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, actually our study here is only based on the existing research, and mostly we follow the IPCC guidelines, which is in the IPCC 2013 supplementary wetlands. It stated that the DOC losses also included or can be counted, although it is not so significant in this from our calculations, but we still think that we just put it to make sure that we have a comprehensive analysis. So whether it is still debatable, I think it is still open for further
component is already challenging, and there's been a lot of progress in the past years. And if you compare the data availability in Indonesia to peatlands of Africa or Latin America, there is a lot of data. So, but there is research going on that, not only for carbon but also for nitrous oxide and also for methane emissions. So there is work going on, and I think from the IPCC, the next round will be in 2024, and at that moment there will be more data available to generate default emission factors that are more accurate. Any other question? Or everybody is very hungry? No? So I think we're going to wrap up. I'm sorry that we didn't have a time for a discussion, but maybe we can do that over lunch. Thank you to everyone for being here, and enjoy the lunch.